In the history of warfare, defeat usually arrives with the sound of an explosion. It comes with the scream of a Stuka dive bomber, the rumble of a T-34 tank, or the mushroom cloud of an atomic bomb. But for the Imperial Japanese Army in the Pacific, defeat did not always sound like a bang. Sometimes it tasted like vanilla. There is a persistent story from the end of the Second World War, an anecdote shared by exhausted, starving Japanese officers in interrogation rooms from Manila to Tokyo. They were men who had endured the banzai charges, the flamethrowers, and the carpet bombing. They had seen the might of the American military-industrial complex level mountains and turn islands into glass. But there was one specific machine that broke their spirit. One specific display of logistical arrogance that convinced them, finally and truly, that the war was hopeless. It wasn't the B-29 Superfortress. It wasn't the Essex-class aircraft carrier. It was a barge made of concrete. A barge that had no guns, no armor, no engines of its own, and no strategic value whatsoever. A barge whose sole, dedicated purpose was to manufacture ice cream. While the Japanese Empire was struggling to ship rice to its starving garrisons, resorting to submarines to smuggle bags of grain past the blockade, United States Navy was towing a $1 million floating factory across the Pacific Ocean to ensure that its sailors could have a frozen treat every afternoon. This is the story of the ultimate logistical flex. It is the story of how the United States weaponized the standard of living. It is the story of the ice cream barge, and how the sheer, crushing weight of American industrial excess didn't just defeat the enemy on the battlefield, it broke their minds. To understand why an ice cream barge acts as a weapon of war, you first have to understand the brutal arithmetic of the Pacific theater. By 1943, the war in the Pacific had devolved into a contest of supply chains. The distances were incomprehensible. From San Francisco to the front lines in the Solomon Islands is nearly 6,000 miles. From Tokyo to those same islands is 3,000 miles. On paper, Japan had the advantage of shorter interior lines. In reality, the Japanese merchant marine was being strangled to death. American submarines were systematically erasing the Japanese capacity to move cargo. The result was a famine of biblical proportions among the Japanese forward units. In New Guinea, the Japanese 18th Army was dying not from bullets, but from starvation. Soldiers were reduced to eating pigweed, jungle roots, and in the darkest chapters of the war, the flesh of the dead. A Japanese soldier in 1944 was fighting two wars, one against the Americans, and one against his own empty stomach. His rifle was often rusted. His uniform was rotting off his body. He had not seen a fresh vegetable or a piece of meat in 6 months. He was fighting on sheer fanatical willpower, fueled by the belief that his spirit was stronger than the enemy's material greed. And then he looked across the lines. What he saw was not just an enemy army. He saw a moving city of abundance. The United States military didn't just bring soldiers to the fight. It brought America to the fight. It brought the entire American standard of living, crated up, refrigerated, and shipped halfway around the world. While the Japanese soldier counted his grains of rice, the American GI was complaining about the brand of cigarettes in his ration pack. While the Japanese officer rationed water, the American Navy was converting salt water into fresh water at a rate of millions of gallons a day, just so its sailors could take hot showers. This disparity was not an accident. It was a doctrine. The U.S. War Department had calculated that the single greatest asset of the American soldier was his morale, and morale was a function of comfort. If you could make a kid from Iowa feel like he was still in Iowa even while he was sitting in a foxhole, on Saipan, he would fight harder, longer, and more effectively than a starving fanatic. And the cornerstone of that American comfort was ice cream. It sounds absurd today. Ice cream in a war zone? It seems like a frivolous luxury, a distraction. But in 1942, The U.S. Navy classified ice cream not as a treat, but as an essential food group. Why? Because of a decision made 30 years earlier that had left the U.S. Navy high and dry. On July 1, 1914, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels issued General Order 99. With the stroke of a pen, he banned the use or introduction for drinking purposes of alcoholic liquors on board any naval vessel. The U.S. Navy became a dry navy. For centuries, sailors had run on rum. The tot of grog was as essential to naval life as the anchor or the sail. It was the sedative that numbed the boredom of long voyages and the terror of battle. When Daniels took that away, he left a psychological vacuum. You cannot take thousands of young men, put them in steel boxes in the middle of the ocean for months at a time, and expect them to stay sane with just coffee and water. They needed a substitute. They needed a new vice. They found it in sugar. By the outbreak of World War II, the Geedunk stand, the ship's soda fountain, had replaced the grog tub. Ice cream became the new alcohol. It was the reward for a hard shift. It was the currency of favors. It was the taste of home. The Navy realized that on a dry ship, the ice cream freezer was the center of gravity for crew morale. It became a protected asset. Consider the sinking of the USS Lexington at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. The massive carrier was burning, crippled by Japanese torpedoes and bombs. The order was given to abandon ship. Thousands of sailors were scrambling for the life rafts, sliding down ropes into the oil-slicked water. But a group of survivors later reported a strange sight in the middle of the disaster. While the ship was literally exploding beneath their feet, a group of sailors in the galley weren't running for the exits. They were breaking into the freezers. They were gorging themselves on the ship's supply of ice cream. They filled their helmets with it. They ate it with their hands. They reasoned that the ship was going down anyway, and they'd be damned if they were going to let the Japanese sink the chocolate ripple. This story circulated through the fleet and became a legend. It highlighted a fundamental truth. For the American sailor, ice cream wasn't just food. It was a defiant assertion of normalcy in the face of death. So, when the Navy began planning the massive logistical push across the Central Pacific, the island-hopping campaign, the admirals faced a unique engineering challenge. They weren't just calculating tons of ammunition and gallons of aviation fuel. They were calculating gallons of strawberry syrup and pounds of sprinkles. They needed to figure out how to keep millions of gallons of milk frozen in the tropics, where the ambient temperature was 95 degrees and the humidity was 100%. They needed a cold chain that stretched from the dairy farms of Wisconsin to the coral atolls of Micronesia. And for the smaller ships, the destroyers, the destroyer escorts, the PT boats that didn't have room for their own ice cream machines, the Navy needed a delivery system. They couldn't just build a refrigerator. They had to build a ship. The result was the BRL, the barge Refrigerated, large. It was one of the strangest vessels ever commissioned by the United States Navy, and to the Japanese, it was an insult to the very concept of war. The BRL was not built for speed. It was not built for looks. In fact, it wasn't even built of steel. By 1944, steel was a strategic material. It was needed for tanks, carriers, and shells. The War Department didn't want to waste precious steel on a barge that would just sit at anchor in a lagoon. So they went back to a material that had been experimented with in World War I, concrete. 3 of these barges were earmarked for a special destiny. Their names were USS Hydrogen, USS Calcium, and USS Antimony. The hull of the ice cream barge was cast from reinforced concrete. It was essentially a floating building. It had no engines of its own. It was a parasite, a massive gray slab that had to be towed across the ocean by fleet tugs, moving at a crawl of 5 or 6 knots. But inside that concrete shell was a marvel of American industrial engineering. This was not a kitchen. It was a factory. The barge cost $1 million in 1945 currency. Adjusted for inflation, that is nearly $17 million today. Think about that. The United States spent $17 million on a single boat. To make dessert, the specifications were staggering. The main deck housed a massive ammonia-based refrigeration plant. The machinery was powered by diesel generators that could light a small town. The production capacity was industrial. The barge could churn out 10 gallons of finished ice cream every 7 minutes. That is 500 gallons per shift. Running 24 hours a day, a single barge could produce enough ice cream to give a scoop to every sailor in a task force. But production was only half the battle. Storage was the other. The BRL had cavernous insulated holds capable of storing 1,500 tons of frozen meat, and then 500 tons of fresh vegetables, cheese, and eggs. And of course, it had a dedicated hardening room, capable of storing 2,000 gallons of ice cream at a bone-chilling temperature. Working on the ice cream barge was a surreal experience. Sailors would spend their shift in heavy parkas, handling frozen sides of beef and tubs of vanilla in sub-zero temperatures. Then they would step out onto the deck and be hit by the wall of 100-degree tropical heat. It was a floating paradox, a bubble of artificial winter in the middle of the equatorial furnace. And when the BRL arrived at a forward base like the massive fleet anchorage at Ulithi Atoll, it became the most popular ship in the harbor. To the modern eye, the vessel looks like a mistake. It has the hydrodynamic profile of a brick. It has no bow wave, no sleek lines, and no engines. But the most offensive thing about the BRL, the barge, refrigerated, large, wasn't its shape. It was its material. It was made of stone. By 1943, the United States was producing more steel than the rest of the world combined. But the appetite of the war machine was infinite. Every ton of steel was accounted for earmarked for the hull of an Essex-class carrier, the glacis plate of a Sherman tank, or the casing of a 500-pound bomb. The War Production Board watched the steel allocation tables with hawk-like intensity. They were not about to waste high-grade armor plate on a floating freezer. So the Navy turned to a material that had been briefly experimented with in World War I and then discarded as a novelty: ferro cement. These weren't just crude blocks of cement. The B-7D-1 class barges, built by the Belair shipyard in South San Francisco, were feats of structural engineering. The hull wasn't poured like a sidewalk. It was a complex mesh of steel rebar and wire mesh plastered with a high-grade, lightweight aggregate concrete known as haydite. The engineering logic was sound, if bizarre. Concrete is cheap. It is readily available. It does not rust. It is immune to the teredo worms that eat wooden hulls in the tropics. And crucially, it has a massive thermal mass. A concrete hull is essentially a giant insulator perfect for keeping the Pacific heat out and the sub-zero cold in. The U.S. Navy built a small fleet of these stone leviathans. Most were designated as floating warehouses, but 3 of them, the USS Hydrogen, the USS Calcium, and the USS Antimony, were destined for a higher purpose. They were fitted out not just to store food, but to manufacture morale. If you walked onto the main deck of the USS Hydrogen in 1944, you wouldn't smell the sea. You would smell diesel fuel and ammonia. This vessel was a floating power plant. Because it had no propulsion engines, the entire internal volume of the barge could be dedicated to machinery. The heart of the beast was the power generation room, housing massive diesel generators capable of outputting enough electricity to light a small American town. They needed that power for one thing: the compressors. The refrigeration system was an industrial-grade ammonia compression plant. Ammonia is toxic and dangerous. A leak in a confined ship can be fatal, but it is thermodynamically efficient. The system circulated supercooled refrigerant through miles of insulated piping that ran through the ship's cavernous holds. The main hold was the hardening room. In the ice cream business, the product comes out of the churn as a soft, semi-solid, think soft serve. To make it transportable, it has to be flash frozen to a solid block. The hardening room on the BRL was kept at a bone-cracking 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The working conditions were physically jarring. The ice cream machinist's a real, if unofficial, job title would spend 4-hour shifts inside the Arctic Circle of the hardening room, bundled in fur-lined parkas. Then they would step through the airlock and be instantly blasted by the 100-degree heat and 90% humidity of the Micronesian tropics. They were literally walking between winter and summer 20 times a day. But the star of the show was the machine itself. The Navy sourced the finest commercial ice cream freezers available, often from the Emery Thompson Machine and Supply Company. These weren't home appliances. They were continuous feed, chrome-plated beasts capable of churning out 10 gallons of finished product every 7 minutes. Do the math. That is roughly 85 gallons an hour. Running on a standard wartime shift, a single barge could produce 500 gallons of ice cream every single day. And storage? The concrete belly of the barge could hold 2,000 gallons of finished ice cream, along with 1,500 tons of frozen meat and 500 tons of cheese, eggs, and vegetables. To the Japanese officers trying to feed a regiment on a bag of weevil-infested rice, these numbers would have seemed like science fiction. But having the machine is useless if you don't have the fuel. And the fuel for an ice cream barge is milk. This presented a logistical nightmare. Fresh milk is 87% water. It is heavy, bulky, and spoils within days, even under refrigeration. You cannot ship fresh milk from San Francisco to Saipan. The solution was the mechanical cow. The Navy deployed a device called the mechanical cow to hundreds of ships. This machine mixed unsalted butter, non-fat dry milk powder, and water under high pressure and heat, then emulsified it to create a fluid that, if you closed your eyes and used a lot of imagination, tasted like fresh milk. For the ice cream barges, the recipe was even more industrial. They utilized a standardized ice cream mix powder, a dehydrated blend of milk solids, sugar, and stabilizers. Consider the global reach required just to make a chocolate milkshake in 1944. The vanilla beans had to be sourced from Madagascar or Mexico, navigating U-boat-infested waters to reach processing plants in New Jersey. The sugar had to be harvested in Hawaii or the Caribbean, refined and packaged. The cacao had to come from South America. The United States Navy was dedicating convoy space precious cargo tonnage that could have carried bullets or blood plasma to transport vanilla extract across the ocean. Why? Because the dry Navy demanded it. The obsession with ice cream wasn't just a quirk of the American palate. It was a direct consequence of a bureaucratic order signed 30 years earlier. On July 1, 1914, Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels issued General Order 99. With that signature, he banned use or introduction for drinking purposes of alcoholic liquors on board any naval vessel. Overnight, a daily ration of rum, a naval tradition dating back to the age of sail, was gone. The U.S. Navy became the only major fleet in the world that was bone dry. This created a vacuum. Sailors needed a vice. They needed a release. They needed a treat to break the monotony of weeks at sea. When alcohol was taken away, the American sailor turned to sugar. The Geedunk stand, the ship's soda fountain, replaced the grog tub. By World War II, ice cream had become the designated morale booster of the fleet. It was the reward for a job well done. It was the currency of favors. Naval doctors even encouraged it. They argued that while alcohol dulled the senses and slowed reaction times, the sugar rush from ice cream provided a burst of energy. They claimed it made the American sailor sharper, faster, and more alert than his rum-soaked British counterpart. Whether that physiology was sound is debatable, but the psychological effect was undeniable. A legend of the USS Lexington proved it. When the great carrier was sinking at the Battle of the Coral Sea in 1942, exploding and burning, survivors reported seeing sailors breaking into the galley freezers. They weren't looting gold. They were gorging on the ship's supply of ice cream before it went to the bottom. They filled their helmets with chocolate ripple. They ate it on the flight deck while the ship burned around them. It was a final act of defiance, a way of saying, the enemy can sink our ship, but they can't take our dessert. With this kind of demand, the Navy knew they couldn't just rely on shipboard freezers. They needed a distribution hub. They needed a central bank of calories. They needed Service Squadron 10. By late 1944, the war had moved to the doorstep of Japan. The staging ground for the final assaults was at Ulithi Atoll, a massive submerged volcanic crater in the Caroline Islands. It was the secret anchorage of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. It was huge, capable of holding 700 ships, and it was boring. Ulithi was thousands of miles from civilization. There were no towns, no bars, no women. Just heat, water, and steel. For the hundreds of thousands of men stuck there while their ships were resupplied, boredom was a more dangerous enemy than the Japanese. In this vacuum, a black market emerged, and the most stable currency was ice cream. The BRL barges, usually anchored near the center of the lagoon, became the Federal Reserve of this economy. Small craft PT boats, minesweepers, and landing craft would swarm the barges. These smaller boats didn't have freezers. Their crews lived on Spam and crackers. For them, a 5-gallon tub of strawberry ice cream was worth more than gold. There are recorded instances of PT boat commanders trading Japanese Arisaka rifles, samurai swords, and even bottles of medicinal brandy to the supply officers on the BRLs in exchange for extra rations of ice cream. On the aircraft carriers, a different tradition emerged. If a pilot was shot down and rescued by a destroyer, the carrier captain would ransom the pilot back. The standard price for a returned aviator was 20 gallons of ice cream. If the pilot was an ace, the price went up. Destroyers would proudly display the gallons they had earned by fishing wet pilots out of the sea. It turned a life-saving operation into a game, strengthening the bond between the Airedales in the sky and the tin can sailors below. Japanese submarine commanders, peering through their periscopes at these anchorages, saw something that defied their understanding of war. They saw a fleet that never slept. They saw lights. They saw specialized ships for every conceivable function, ships that did nothing but distill water, ships that did nothing but bake bread, ships that did nothing but freeze ice cream. To the Japanese military mind, this was insanity. The Imperial Navy was built on the philosophy of the decisive battle. You built warships to fight. You didn't build ships to pamper the crew. Logistics were an afterthought. Comfort was a weakness. But as they watched the Americans fight, they realized that this weakness was actually a terrifying strength. The American sailor was well-fed, rested, and morale boosted. The Japanese sailor was malnourished, exhausted, and fueled only by desperation. The ice cream barge proved that the Americans could afford to waste resources on luxury and still overwhelm the Japanese in combat tonnage. It was a thermodynamic victory. The Japanese were fighting against the laws of entropy. The Americans had simply air-conditioned them. Put yourself in the boots of a Japanese lieutenant in 1944. You are stationed on a bypassed island in the Pacific. You have been taught that the Americans are weak. You have been taught that they are soft, a mongrel nation of shopkeepers who cannot endure hardship. Your propaganda tells you that the Yamato spirit, the spiritual superiority of the Japanese warrior, will overcome the material advantages of the West. You believe that war is a test of suffering. You eat your weevil-infested rice. You endure the malaria. You wait for the Americans to break. And then you capture a prisoner. Or you find a discarded crate. Or you read a captured letter, and you learn that the enemy is not suffering. They are not eating roots. They are not rationing rice. They are eating ice cream. The realization hit the Japanese officer corps like a physical blow. It wasn't just jealousy. It was a terrifying strategic revelation. If the United States Navy could afford to dedicate millions of dollars, thousands of tons of shipping, and precious manpower just to manufacture a luxury item, what did that say about their capacity for real weapons? It meant that the U.S. economy was not even straining. It meant that the American war machine had so much excess capacity that it could treat the Pacific War like a logistical hobby. If they can ship ice cream, they can ship anything. For the Japanese soldier, who was told that every bullet was precious, the idea of an ice cream ship was incomprehensible. It signaled a level of industrial dominance that made resistance futile. It proved that the U.S. wasn't just winning. They were winning with one hand tied behind their back, holding a spoon in the other. There is a documented account of a Japanese colonel who surrendered later in the war. When he was interrogated, he didn't ask about the atomic bomb. He didn't ask about the B-29s. He asked if the story about the ice cream ships was true. When his captors confirmed it, he reportedly slumped in his chair and said, "We never stood a chance." He realized that his men had starved to death, fighting an enemy who had solved the problem of survival so completely that they had moved on to the problem of dessert. This was the psychological superweapon of the BRL barges. They were floating monuments to the futility of Axis resistance. They projected a message across the water. We have more fuel than you. We have more steel than you. We have so much, we can afford to waste it. The Japanese were fighting a war of scarcity. The Americans were fighting a war of surplus. In 1944, while Japan was melting down temple bells to make shell casings, the U.S. Navy was using high-grade steel to make soft-serve machines. It was a thermodynamic victory. The Japanese were fighting against the laws of entropy. The Americans had simply air-conditioned them. But what happened to these concrete leviathans? Where is the USS Hydrogen today? The ice cream barges served until the very end. They followed the fleet to Okinawa. They prepared to support the invasion of Japan itself. But when the atomic bombs fell and the war ended, the BRLs were unceremoniously dumped. They were slow, ugly, and expensive to maintain. They were creatures of war, designed for a specific logistical ecosystem that no longer existed. The Navy didn't want to tow a concrete block all the way back to San Francisco. Some were scuttled. Some were sold for scrap. Some were simply left to rot in the lagoons of the Pacific, their concrete hulls cracking, their rebar rusting, turning into artificial reefs for the fish. Today, they are forgotten. You won't find a memorial to the USS Calcium. There are no medals for the ice cream machinist's mates who kept the Freon compressors running during air raids. But in the grand calculus of victory, these ugly, slow, concrete blocks played a role as vital as the carriers they served. They sustained the human element of the machine. They proved that while an army fights on its stomach, a navy fights on its morale. History books often focus on the tooth of the military, the tanks, the planes, the guns. But the ice cream barge reminds us that the tail, the logistics, the supply chain, the creature comforts is what allows the teeth to bite. The United States didn't just outfight the Japanese Empire. It outproduced them, outshipped them, and yes, outate them. In the end, the war wasn't won by the side that wanted it more. It was won by the side that had the ships for ice cream. So, does the ice cream barge still exist? Can you visit the machine that broke the Japanese spirit? If you travel to the Sunshine Coast of British Columbia, to a place called Powell River, you will find the answer. There, curving out into the Malaspina Strait, is a massive arc-shaped breakwater. From a distance, it looks like a gray, rocky wall protecting the logging mill. But when you get closer, you realize that the wall is made of ships. 10 massive, concrete hulls, floating continuously since 1944. They are the ghost fleet of Powell River. These are the sisters of the USS Hydrogen. They are trefoil-class concrete barges, the exact same design, cast from the same molds, built in the same Bel Air shipyard in San Francisco. They were bought for pennies on the dollar after the war, towed north, and chained together to fight the tides. They are stripped of their ammonia compressors. Their hardening rooms are empty. Trees and blackberry bushes grow from their decks. Their iron rebar bleeds rust down the sides of the gray concrete. But if you stand on the deck of the YOGN-82 at Powell River, you can feel the sheer industrial weight of the American war effort. You are standing on a vessel that was built to be disposable. A vessel built of rock because steel was too precious, yet engineered with such resilience that it has outlasted the steel destroyers it was built to serve. The USS Hydrogen itself likely met a different fate scuttled in a lagoon or broken up for road fill in the Philippines. Its physical form is gone, but its legacy is etched into the doctrine of modern warfare. The ice cream barge taught the U.S. military a lesson it never forgot. Logistics is not just about moving bullets. It's about moving a lifestyle. Today, when a U.S. aircraft carrier deploys, it carries Starbucks baristas. When an American Ford operating base is built in the desert, it comes with Burger King trailers and gyms and internet cafes. The tale of the American military is still massive, still expensive, and still criticized by accountants. But the lesson of 1944 remains. You do not win a global war by starving your men to make them tough. You win by crushing the enemy's hope. And nothing destroys hope faster than watching your enemy eat ice cream while you are digging for roots. The USS Hydrogen was the ultimate flex. It was a weapon system that fired no shots, but hit the enemy harder than a torpedo. It proved that in the industrial age, the greatest power is not the ability to destroy, but the ability to produce so much, so fast, that you can turn the impossible into the mundane. To the Japanese, it was a ship. To the Americans, it was just dessert.